Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Mille Feuille. That's right, that is pretty close to the correct pronunciation. But if you're having trouble, don't worry. You can always call it what us short, insecure men call it, and that would be a Napoleon. But either way, this is a shockingly easy technique that you really need to learn, since you can make so many cool desserts with it, and people will actually think you know what you're doing. Which this time of year is kind of a big deal, because there are so many special occasions we need fancy desserts for. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the secret ingredient. Store-bought frozen puff pastry. Oh yeah. And one of these times I'm actually going to show you how to make puff pastry from scratch. But this is definitely not one of those times. So what we'll do once our pastry is thawed is transfer that onto some kind of baking sheet lined with a silpat. And while normally the way this puff pastry is folded up causes problems, because we're generally trying to use the whole sheet, for this that is no issue at all. So I simply separated that at the seams, and we'll place that down on our baking sheet. And then before this goes in the oven, we have to do two things: the docking and the dusting. And all docking is a fancy culinary term for pricking the dough with a fork. And I guess if you wanted to, you could use 2 hands and 2 forks, and theoretically finish in half the time. But I get paid by the hour, so I'm in no hurry. And in case you're wondering, the reason we're doing this is because all those holes are going to prevent the puff pastry from rising too much. Okay, normally we want this stuff to puff up nice and high, but here what we're going for is nice, thin, crisp layers. So we'll go ahead and dock that all over. And once our dough's been docked, it's ready to be dusted with some good old-fashioned granulated white sugar. Not too much, but we do want to lightly dust that over the entire surface. At which point this is ready to cover with several things. The first of which would be some parchment paper that we will place over the top, followed by 3 or 4 layers of foil that I folded up. And then last but not least, we will press everything down with another sheet pan. And by the way, the foil is only there so the top sheet pan comes in a little better contact with the pastry. So depending on the pans you're using, that may or may not be necessary. And I will touch on that in the blog post. But anyway, once that's set, we can go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 400-degree oven for 15 minutes, at which point we'll pull it out. But don't get excited, it's not done. All we're going to do is remove the paper and the foil and the top pan, but not necessarily in that order. And hopefully, thanks to that pressing and the docking, we're going to have some nice flat pastry, which we do. Although as you can see, it's still way too raw. So what we're going to do is simply pop that back in the oven, still at 400, and cook it uncovered for another 10 to 15 minutes or so, or until beautifully browned, which unfortunately this isn't yet. But that's okay, this only had another 7 or 8 minutes, and the only reason I pulled it out is so I could give these a flip, which I guess is optional. I mean, technically, if you think about it, everything's optional. But I do think it browns a little more evenly if we give them a flip. And then I pop those back in for another 7 or 8 minutes, or like I said, until our pastry is beautifully browned and crispy. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something very, very similar to this. Okay, so do not, under any circumstances, stop until this is gorgeous. And then what we're going to do, and this is almost as important as cooking it properly, is that we must let this cool completely before we try to cut and fill it. So let's go ahead and transfer those onto a baking rack. And no, warm is not okay. Let those cool all the way down to room temp. And then once everything's nicely cooled, we can proceed to the cutting. And for this, what you're going to want is some kind of long serrated knife. And by taking your time and using a nice sawing motion, you should get some beautiful, clean, straight cuts. And this may look like I'm putting a lot of effort into it, as if the pastry was too tough to cut, but that's not it. It's because I'm hardly putting any pressure on that knife. I'm just holding that very lightly, sawing back and forth, letting the weight of the knife and our good friend gravity do most of the work. And by the way, I didn't, but if you want, before you bake your puff pastry, you can roll it first, so that this comes out even thinner and more delicate. Okay, so that's going to depend on what kind of texture you're going for. But because I like lots of that crunchy, buttery pastry, I did not do that. So that's something you're going to have to decide. You are, after all, the Michelle Wie of your Mille Feuille. And then what we'll do once our pastry is squared off is make 3 rectangles, using the first one we cut as a guide, so the other ones are sort of uniform, or at least close enough for YouTube. And speaking of 3 rectangles of puff pastry, I probably should have mentioned already that Mille Feuille means 1,000 layers, or 1,000 sheets, or 1,000 leaves. It depends on who you talk to. But anyway, since each of these rectangles have hundreds of layers, when we stack all 3 for our finished dessert, we will have our 1,000 layers. Although actually, I think it's more like 700. But hey, who has time to count? We need to fill these and eat. So let's proceed to final assembly. And for this first version we're going to do, let me show you how to do the traditional icing design on the top layer, which we will start by covering with plain white icing. And yes, we do have a recipe for that, which I will include in the blog post. It is nothing more than powdered sugar, thinned with a little water or milk. So the first thing we'll do is cover that with our plain white icing. And then we'll take the exact same stuff that we mixed in a little bit of chocolate, and we will do some stripes across this way. And it was right about here I realized I had way too much icing. So I did sort of get an unintended Salvador Dali look here. But anyway, forget about that for a minute. Let me show you how to finish the design. And that's by taking a toothpick and dragging it through 3 times this way, 1 on either side and 1 in the middle. And then we will simply drag our toothpick the opposite direction in between those lines, and that's going to give us that classic pattern. And notwithstanding way too much icing, that is not too bad. But that was way too much icing, so I did try it again with less, like half the amount, which worked way better. And the great thing about this is as long as you're doing your 3 lines one way, and then your opposite lines go in the other direction in between, you're going to achieve an appearance that looks way harder than it really is. I mean, come on, for an old line cook, that looks pretty good. And then once our top is done, we'll place one of our pieces of pastry down and pipe on a very generous amount of pastry cream. And yes, we've done that video too, but don't use it. I'm going to show you a new and improved version in a couple days. But in the meantime, your favorite pastry cream recipe will work. So we'll go ahead and do 2 very generous layers of pastry cream before topping it with our very complex, incredibly difficult, yet unbelievably easy to make pattern on top. And that's it, our vanilla custard Mille Feuille is done, and looking like something our guests will never believe in a million years we could possibly make ourselves. Which in one way is kind of insulting, but in another way very complimentary. So that right there is what I would consider the classic version. But wait, there's more. This stuff is also amazing for doing fresh fruit Napoleons, which you can see me building here with some fresh raspberries. So we will put 6 down on a layer, and then we'll pipe our pastry cream in between, and we'll do 2 layers of that. Oh, and by the way, if you want, you could just use whipped cream instead of pastry cream, or even a combination of both, which is very nice. But anyway, we'll go ahead and build 2 layers like that. And then to finish this one, we won't go with the icing. We'll go with a simple dusting of powdered sugar. But before we do, we'll lay down a couple chopsticks, or something similar. And that way, once we're done dusting the sugar, we can remove those to leave 2 stripes revealing our beautiful golden brown pastry. And really, how much better does a simple visual trick like that make this? A lot. More than most people would think. But anyway, that's it. Just wanted to show you another version you could do with fruit. So let me go ahead and grab a fork and dig into this one, since I didn't get to eat the other one. Allegedly. And by the way, if you're new to the channel and wondering why it doesn't look like I know how to eat, it's because for some reason I'm always looking in the viewfinder of the camera and not at the plate. So it always looks like I'm much more uncoordinated than I really am. But anyway, eventually I did get some in my mouth, and it was totally worth the wait. I mean, the combination of that fresh fruit with that creamy vanilla custard and that buttery, crunchy, slightly sweet pastry is just a beautiful experience. And as you saw, one you can enjoy without a whole heck of a lot of work. And by the way, when you're leaving drips on your cutting board that look like this, you're having a pretty good day. So I really do hope you give this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.